Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Alongside Joe Mathieu here in Washington, where we are keeping track of the transition, which seems to be picking up its pace here as Donald Trump has been announcing more and more people who will either serve in his cabinet or be close to him during his second administration. Some, of course, being tapped for positions that don't require Senate approval and confirmation. But the cabinet is going to be especially interesting here as we consider who the big players will be around the table with him, and especially as we consider the Treasury Secretary, potentially, knowing that someone actually took themselves out of the running today. John Paulson, in a statement, said it would be too financially complicated given his complex financial obligations for him to serve in this role, which does seem to be shortening the list. And Bloomberg is reporting today, our colleagues Saleha, Mohsin, and Jeanne Leonard, that topping the list potentially, at least to some Trump advisors who are pushing for this, would be Scott Bessent of Key Square Group, the macro hedge fund. Remember, we spoke with him on this program before the election. Take a listen to part of our conversation.
He has a deep understanding of financial markets as opposed to most politicians. So he wants to be involved in the conversation. He has very well-formed opinions. He has a lot of private sector friends. So he just wants to be a voice.
That's where we start our conversation with Bloomberg senior Washington correspondent Saleha Mohsin, of course, host of the Big Take DC podcast, something we talk about with Saleha pretty often here. She's also spearheading our coverage of the transition. In time to name names, Saleha, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us today. Did we just see the next Treasury Secretary there?
Maybe we did. According to our reporting here at Bloomberg, it looks like most of Trump's key advisors are supporting Scott Bessent for the job of Treasury Secretary, but Trump himself has not weighed in. He has not made a decision.
Well, but he has heralded Bessent repeatedly on the campaign trail, calling him out at rallies, that kind of thing. We understand that these two are actually quite close. So I wonder why this is taking so long, given Trump has already announced many others. If it were obvious that it would be Bessent, wouldn't we know that already?
I guess so. I mean, we all want to know desperately. Obviously, we are Bloomberg. But at the same time, Marco Rubio for Secretary of State, that has not been announced, right?
Fair.
So we're still waiting on a couple that have been floated, soft floated, air tested, who knows, whatever you want to call it. But they have not been formally announced. And who knows how things are panning out at Mar-a-Lago, whether they want to float names, see what happens, or call people down for interviews, or if advisors are just getting ready for if Donald Trump, President-elect Donald Trump says, who do you think I want for this? We have our ducks in a row. We know what we want to tell you.
It's moving pretty quickly this time. I was recalling in our last hour the Apprentice-style walk we saw in 2016. Everybody had to go in the lobby of Trump Tower, awkwardly wait for the elevator, choose to say something to a reporter if they wanted to, and then go do the audition or the interview. We're rolling them out pretty quickly this time, a much more concerted and deliberate process, it feels like.
Well, so far, it's pretty organized.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's a reflection of how the campaign itself was, much more organized compared to Trump's efforts in 2016 and in 2020. We have the first female White House Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, who was overseeing much of his campaign, and she has really kept things organized, including the number of leaks.
Well, so as we consider the names that have been whether leaked out or actually outright confirmed, they do include, and you mentioned Marco Rubio, which hasn't been confirmed by the president-elect yet. They include a lot of current members of the House or the Senate. Elise Stefanik tapped for UN ambassador, Congressman Mike Waltz of Florida for a national security advisor, and then, of course, Senator Rubio. Should we expect more of the picks that are announced going forward to come from Congress, or is he not going to want to pull too much out of what looks like it could be a very narrow majority in the House, at least?
Look, just speculation on my part, looking at the information that we have in front of us, if there is a narrow majority in the Senate for Republicans, they're only going to want to pull senators from the chamber if they can reliably replace that Senate seat with a Republican. So I think that there is an air of caution of how many to pull. We don't know what the margin is for the House side, but we did see the National Security Advisor is coming from the House. So maybe there's a little bit more wiggle room there.
Is there a hope that this cabinet stays together longer than the original one? It does seem like there is some consistency here in bringing in loyalists, also checking the box of central casting that we know Donald Trump likes to check. but not to have the revolving door that they experienced the first time around.
Yeah, it would be great for all of us if there's not the same revolving door. It would be great for markets and economic policy. Last time around, we saw the Treasury Secretary, then it was Stephen Mnuchin. He stuck by for 4 years. That gave a lot of stability to economic policy. Let's see if we get the same thing. I mean, this time around, if we can have a Secretary of State who stays, there was high turnover in that slot, and White House Chief of Staff. Now, if we're looking at how things have run so far in 2024 with Susie Wiles, maybe we will see more stability.
Well, and Susie Wiles, as I alluded to earlier, one of the folks that isn't going to require confirmation from the Senate, just like Stephen Miller, who we understand has been tapped for Deputy Chief of Staff for policy. But this is really just putting him in a position to help influence policy, especially when it comes to the border and immigration. Absolutely.
All of these jobs come with great big titles. A lot of them do have firm job descriptions, but a lot of it, especially the roles that don't need Senate confirmation, like White House Chief of Staff or Deputy Chief of Staff, there's a lot of leeway on what kind of job description you want to have, what you go in with, and what your boss ultimately gives you.
All right, Bloomberg's Saleha Mohsin. You can check out all of her reporting on this transition on the Bloomberg terminal or online. Thank you so much for joining us. And it's remarkable to consider here, Joe, as Donald Trump has alluded to the fact that he sees himself as coming to this office a second time around with even more of a mandate than he perhaps had before, having won, of course, the popular vote and also having at least the Senate backing him, in addition, potentially, to the House once we know whether or not that's called, which just speaks to the fact that while we expected this race to be close, and in a lot of ways it was, it also brought with it a full red sweep.
Well, that's for sure. A red sweep that we can now quantify almost entirely. We're still waiting for the House, and they could be as little as one race away, as a matter of fact. With the 7 contested seats left, Republicans need to turn one. We actually have more like 15 that have yet to be called, but that's how razor-thin things are in the House. And when Donald Trump is up there tomorrow, I suspect he's going to be talking about the leadership battles that we're about to endure. The vote's set for Wednesday. Mike Johnson probably comfortable where he is. The question is, who replaces Mitch McConnell?
Yeah. Is it going to be a John Thune or John Cornyn, or perhaps could it be the dark horse candidate Rick Scott that it does seem those close to Trump are now pushing for? We're going to have to wait to find out, but we didn't want to wait to touch back in with Andra Gillespie of Emory University. She, of course, is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science. We were checking in with her frequently throughout this election cycle and want to check back with her now as we continue to do the postmortem here. Andra, welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. While Joe is right to point out we don't for sure know that the House is going to be still a Republican majority. We still got to get a few more race calls, but it is the prevailing wisdom that Republicans will be able to keep a narrow hold on that chamber. So I wonder what that says to you, that it wasn't just the presidency, but the entirety of Congress potentially that swept one way here.
Well, I mean, this is clearly still a divided country. So if we're looking at the margins, not just by which President Trump won and the margins in the swing states, but we're also looking at what the legislative majorities look like in both the House and the Senate. And I'm certainly anticipating that Republicans are going to retain control of the House. We're still looking at very narrow legislative majorities, which suggests, one, our country is still polarized. And what it also suggests is that the governing coalition is going to have to maintain discipline in order to be effective. And if they cannot maintain discipline, there are going to be ways for Congress to still be at a standstill. So, you can't just blame it on having the president of one party and having one chamber in Congress being controlled by the other for there to be a legislative stalemate. There's still the possibility for that. It's really going to come down to management, and it's going to come down to the ideas and the policies that are being presented.
Well, as Republicans choose their leaders this week, and I don't think we'll have too many surprises, if any, on the House side, Andra, I wonder what the strategy conversation is today between Hakeem Jeffries, Pete Aguilar, and Catherine Clark. The Democratic leadership in the House remains in the minority. What's their plan?
I think what they may be considering is how much to push back and when to fight their battles. Donald Trump certainly has a mandate. He has a bigger mandate because he won the popular vote and not just the Electoral College in this election. But again, it's a narrow mandate. And I think what Democrats may decide to do is to stand back and let Republicans govern, and let's see if the ideas actually hold merit. if they can get through Congress and get signed by the president, and also when implemented, if they actually do work for the American people. If they are perceived as being antagonistic or opposing all things, and not just voting against it, which I expect Democrats to do, but vociferously coming out and attacking everything, it might actually take attention away from the merits of the policies themselves. And if these policies prove to not actually be good for the American people, then the Democrats have their talking points. See, we let Republicans reign and govern in an unfettered kind of way, and the policies that they put forward were disastrous for the American people. So I suspect that they're trying to figure out when is the right time to push back, especially if it involves preserving institutions. But, when do they allow bad policies to come forward so that the American people can see that those policies might not actually be advantageous towards all American people, and including some of the people who voted for Donald Trump? I think that that's probably the direction in which they're headed.
Well, so as we consider those people who voted for Donald Trump, Andra, obviously nothing is monolithic, but we've spent a lot of time talking about the swing we saw toward him in specific demographic groups, including Latinos, some portion of Black men as well. It is the Republican Party that seems like it is attracting more people into a larger tent, one could argue. I wonder what you make of the fact, though, that kind of wider coalition, more multicultural, multi-ethnic coalition doesn't necessarily seem to be manifesting itself in the same way as Donald Trump selects those who will be closest to him as he actually serves as president. Other than Marco Rubio, the people who have been named so far and those we understand to be on the short list, we're talking about a lot of white people.
Well, if you go back and you look at what his cabinet and cabinet equivalent appointments looked like in his first term, he had Nikki Haley and he had Ben Carson. And then if we look at the number of women, we also saw that compared to the Obama, Bush, Clinton administrations, he had far fewer women in positions of leadership. So you can look at people like Nikki Haley or Kirstjen Nielsen, among others who were able to serve Linda McMahon, in positions of power. He hasn't had time to announce his full cabinet slate, so I'll wait to see what the diversity looks like. Marco Rubio is certainly, if he is in fact the designee to be Secretary of State, is certainly a historic choice. He would be the first Latino in this position. I think that it is certainly remarkable in terms of descriptive representation. Susie Wiles' choice is certainly a descriptively representative choice. I think we need to give him time to see how much more diverse it looks. I don't think I'm holding my breath to see if it's going to match the diversity of the Biden or the Obama or the Clinton administrations or even the Bush administrations. But I think that I'm expecting to see a little bit more descriptive diversity amongst the cabinet level picks.
Professor, Donald Trump's coming to town tomorrow. He's going to meet with Joe Biden in the Oval Office. I suspect the optics will be fascinating. Should Joe Biden remind Donald Trump or the reporters in the room that he was not afforded such an invitation 4 years ago?
I don't know what would be gained by bringing that up. I mean, it's certainly a sign of graciousness. I expect that reporters are going to, and analysts are going to make that particular observation. I think this, might be an opportunity for President Biden to talk about how important it is for democracies to have smooth transitions, for losers to accept their defeat gracefully. And by just demonstrating and modeling that, in some ways it might be an indictment of how poorly the last transition was.
Well, fair enough, and they have pledged to make this transition go more smoothly this time around. Andra, finally, before we let you go, of course, the way in which Donald Trump views his mandate here is one that could be potentially much more solid and broader, considering he did claim victory in every single swing state that we were watching, including your state of Georgia. And you know Georgia politics incredibly well. And I wonder, as we can cast forward to 4 more years from now, even 2 more years from now in the midterms, if this was decisive or if Georgia is still going to be swingy in the elections moving forward, knowing that the blue wall, for example, didn't look so blue this time around. In fact, it looked very, very red.
Well, I think, Donald Trump certainly has a mandate, but I think that some of his new supporters are conditional supporters, and they want to see that he makes good on his promises, which probably factored more into the impressions of improving the economy and lowering inflation than it did on some of the other tenets of his platform. We can already see his immigration policy taking shape, and I think voters, supporters, and opponents are going to look to see how efficacious his policies are. He might be able to maintain or or broaden that base if he does it, if he does a good job. But if he doesn't, he might lose some of those supporters. And as far as Georgia is concerned, I think it's important to keep in mind that Kamala Harris lost the state by a margin of about 2.5 percentage points. That's half the margin by which Hillary Clinton lost in 2020. So while the fundamentals of the state of Georgia still favor Republicans, they're favoring them by slimmer margins. And I think 2024 was kind of evidence of the fact that Georgia is still much more competitive than it was 20 years ago.
Andra, it's great to have you back. Andra Gillespie, Emory University Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science, with us just 1 week after the election. We'll assemble our panel next. Lots to talk about on the transition coming up with Jeanne, Zaino, and Chapin right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Welcome back to Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu with some breaking official news in just the last few minutes. We already knew it based off of people familiar with the matter, but Donald Trump is now making it official. He's named Florida Congressman Mike Waltz as his national security advisor, releasing a statement in which he says, in part, Mike has been a strong champion of my America First foreign policy agenda and will be a tremendous champion of our pursuit of peace through strength. And Joe, this is, of course, just another selection that broadly is painting a picture, not only the doubling down on the America First agenda and those close to it. You could say the same through the selection of Congresswoman Elise Stefanik to UN ambassador, and Marco Rubio, we understand, going to be tapped for Secretary of State. But peace through strength, America First is a common thing. And of course, loyal to Trump tops that list of
big time
attributes as well.
This is a retired Special Forces officer, been in the House since 2019, has been a fierce critic of Joe Biden's foreign policy. And so here we are here with one more blank to be filled. We got a bunch of them yesterday as well. Several, not just Congressman Waltz, several from the House of Representatives, where we've got a very thin majority here once again for Speaker Mike Johnson. But Lee Zeldin also came up here. It wasn't just Elise Stefanik to the UN, Lee Zeldin to the EPA, raising a lot of questions about what experience he has helping to manage the environment.
Well, the answer to that question is not a ton, but it does seem that this is, at least he was trying to frame it as more of an economic appointment than anything else, as Donald Trump has talked consistently about helping the economy through lowering energy costs and unleashing oil and gas as well. It makes you wonder what kind of policy and regulatory frameworks we're going to be getting out of the EPA under this administration.
Yeah, to Kailey's point, Congressman Zeldin spoke to this on Fox News from an economic perspective. Here's what he said.
One of the biggest issues for so many Americans was the economy, and the president was talking about unleashing economic prosperity. Through the EPA, we have the ability to pursue energy dominance, to be able to make the United States the artificial intelligence capital of the world, to bring back American jobs to the auto industry, and so much more.
Let's assemble our panel for their take on some of the appointments. The transition is now in full speed, and we have Jeanne Zaino, of course, Democratic analyst and Bloomberg Politics contributor, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, Chapin, Republican strategist and founder of Lighthouse Public Affairs. Great to see you both. Jeanne, what's your thought on not only the broad scope of the appointments that we've heard so far, but specifically Congressman Zeldin, when it comes to the EPA? I realize there's a loyalty test here, but should any of these individuals have areas of expertise that pertain to the agencies they're running?
You know, it's interesting because one of the things we heard from the transition team was they were going to prioritize loyalty and competency. And of course, there is no question Lee Zeldin is competent in a number of ways. He simply, though, does not have a background in this area, but he is appointed, as we understand from what they have said, because he aligns, he's not only loyal, but he aligns with Donald Trump on what Donald Trump would like most of all to happen with the EPA, which is moving towards deregulation and also rolling back, importantly, fossil fuel regulations. And so to your and Kailey's point, in this way, he definitely lines up with where Trump and the Republican Party are headed on this. He just doesn't come with the expertise we might normally expect in an EPA director. But of course, Donald Trump doesn't do anything you'd expect. So from that perspective, it's in keeping with his appointments by and large.
Well, so Chapin, as we look at the list of names we know to this point, whether they've been confirmed by the Trump campaign or just sources are indicating that's the way things are going, are there any that concern you with a lack of expertise or competency in the required area? Or do you think by and large the transition shaping up okay so far?
I think by and large it's shaping up okay, and I would use Congressman Zeldin as an example. I would argue that he does have some environmental bona fides. His district, one of the few in the country that you have to take a ferry to get to election districts, has all sorts of environmental issues, from brownfields to New York's Governor Hochul's whole wind platform is based off the South Shore. There's the fishing industry. Again, a lot of environmental cleanup, fights over the East Hampton Airport that's, critics are saying are noise pollution from helicopters and poisoning the ground out there. So I would argue that his district, who goes from rural to beach to farms to urban, gives him a pretty good platform, more so than other people from Congress across the country for the EPA. And again, I think it is a business type appointment, and he's going to strike the right balance between the environment and business.
Well, how does that work, Jeanne? How do you find or unleash, in his words, economic prosperity through the EPA? Is that the charge of that agency?
It is Donald Trump's charge to the agency. And he, to his credit, he has been very, very clear about this, is that he feels that this is what has been missing in the United States economically over the last 4 years. Certainly, he felt like he was moving in this direction. So he has charged Lee Zeldin, and I would suspect everyone else who he is appointing, that he is going to be focused, in addition to immigration, number one on energy. And the issue of drilling and fossil fuel reigns large for him. Whether he can see that through is a whole nother question. But this is what he promised during the campaign very clearly. And now we have an appointment with somebody who has said that they can deliver on that.
Well, so as we consider the appointments that aren't necessarily confirmed yet, Jeanne, including that of Senator Marco Rubio of Florida being tapped for Secretary of State, I do wonder your feelings as a Democrat on this. Could Donald Trump have made a poor choice? Is that actually one that Democrats might find some comfort in when they're considering the future of foreign policy of the U.S.?
I think so far his appointments have not been particularly unexpected, nor has he made a choice that I think Democrats will line up in droves to object to. It is interesting to see the talk of Marco Rubio. We don't know yet, along with Mike Waltz, suggests that Susie Wiles is playing a big role here. These are two people she has worked closely with. And of course, Rubio, we don't have confirmed yet. Also important to remember as he continues, at least so far, to take some folks out of the House, is that while Donald Trump won a big victory on Tuesday, he comes with arguably one of the narrowest House majorities for Republicans in history. So, he's got to be very careful there. We heard Mike Johnson say that on the steps today. But by and large, I think these are people who know Washington, and the ones that are going to go up for confirmation will likely pass given the majority in the Senate. And of course, Donald Trump has said we need to make appointments during recess if they have a danger of not passing. So he's already, suggesting that if we can't get him through confirmation, we got to do recess appointments. So he is playing those odds already.
Well, we're talking today about the start of the lame duck session, the return of lawmakers to Washington. And there's a loud conversation happening in progressive quarters here, Chapin, about Trump-proofing, as some call it, government, and some of the specific examples having to do with legislation passed by Joe Biden and Democratic lawmakers. Pramila Jayapal, the outgoing chair of the Progressive Caucus, says a lot of things can be undone, but it can take longer to undo them and would force a priority from them on what they want to focus on. They're preparing a raft, as we read today in Axios, of executive orders that President Biden could issue on his way out here to protect, quote, existing structures, such as shielding career civil servants and Justice Department officials. Can this come together in the short amount of time they have?
We'll never say never, but I just don't, I don't think the Progressive Caucus really was wagging the dog with the Biden administration from the get-go. So I don't know that at the end, Joe Biden's going to have that kind of appetite, particularly since some on the right of the aisle have seen him, we have interpreted him as sort of maybe enjoying this moment a little bit too much after Harris has lost. So I don't know that there's an appetite for Joe Biden to sort of, do a flurry of executive orders that is going to make for difficult for President Trump, the incoming president, to get his agenda done. I do see some compromise there where maybe there's a few things that he does, but I don't see any sort of major or wholesale operation from Joe Biden to trip up the incoming administration. I don't think that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and as we consider what the next administration is going to look like, we've been talking a lot about how Donald Trump is likely, Chapin, going to have the cooperation of Congress, with the Senate at least, and very likely a narrow majority in the House. But we saw how difficult that narrow majority has been over the last 2 years for the Republican conference to navigate. Do you have confidence it will be different this time around? And if it's different, what exactly about it will be?
Well, I think there's going to be fewer members who are willing to gum up an entire piece of legislation along partisan or ideological lines, right? I think Trump won in a overwhelming, or Republicans led by Trump won in an overwhelming way on Election Day. And I think Republicans within the caucus may grumble about getting some more stuff for their district or something like that, or shaping bills and shaping the policy. But I think you're going to see that he's going to be able to do the things that he needs to do, even with a small majority in the House.
All right, Chapin Fay, thank you so much for joining us. Republican strategist, of course, and founder of Lighthouse Public Affairs, together with Jeanne Zaino, Democratic strategist and senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, our political panel today. Thank you both so much. And we mentioned, Joe, that we're still awaiting firm confirmation of some of these picks, including Secretary of State selection, potentially, of Senator Marco Rubio. Another one we should mention as well that's been reported by other outlets, not us here at Bloomberg, is Kristi Noem.
That's right.
For the Department of Homeland Security.
According to CNN, I'd be very curious to see an official statement on this. It was leading a lot of newscasts last evening, but it does remind us that they have a long list of names for a lot of jobs, and they're not waiting around to start matching names with positions here, even if they're floating balloons. We're going to know pretty quickly who's going to be in a lot of these positions to fill out the cabinet.
Remarkable to think Election Day was just a week ago.
A week ago today. Imagine where we were then.
Has already changed since then. Of course, we've had that covered for you. We will continue to do so with much more still ahead here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Breaking news from the Trump camp with another appointment here we did not see coming today. As we keep trained on openings on the cabinet, it's an ambassadorial role that emerges with a statement from the former president, now the president-elect, pleased to announce that the former governor of Arkansas, Mike Huckabee, will be the next U.S. ambassador to Israel. Donald Trump writes, Mike has been a great public servant, governor, leader in faith for many years. He loves Israel and the people of Israel, and likewise the people of Israel love him. This just emerging, Kailey, a day after Elise Stefanik was tapped to be U.S. ambassador to the UN.
Yeah, of course, Congresswoman Stefanik has been a vocal proponent of pro-Israel policy. I think many would remember her questioning the presidents of some of the universities that were dealing with protests over this past year. So you certainly are seeing a very pro-Israel batch of people selected to help represent the United States and, frankly, Israel's interest in some of these bodies. It's Trump in that statement saying that Mike will work tirelessly to bring about peace in the Middle East, which does once again raise the question how the Trump administration will be approaching bringing an end to this war, and not only this war, but others as well, including the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. Yeah,
it's interesting as well to learn this the same day that Axios reports Ron Dermer was at Mar-a-Lago to meet with Donald Trump. So this is taking shape as we speak, not just domestically, but when it comes to foreign policy. And some of the questions that we see around the House of Representatives, you mentioned Congresswoman Stefanik, potentially making Mike Johnson's job a little bit more difficult with what appears to be, it's not yet official, but a relatively thin Republican majority, much like he's had since he got the gavel.
Yeah, that's what has made policymaking and legislating on the Hill so difficult over the course of the 118th Congress, is there just wasn't really much room for error. That certainly could be so. We still have, of course, more votes to be counted in a number of states, including California. But Republicans at this point just need to pick one of 7 remaining toss-ups. If they pick that up, that would get them to the 218 required to get the majority. The question is how much wiggle room are they going to have? This is something that Speaker Johnson was talking about on Capitol Hill as lawmakers return to Washington today.
Every single vote will count, because if someone gets ill or has a car accident or a late flight on their plane, that it affects the votes on the floor. So I think he and the administration are well in tune to that. I don't expect that we will have more members leaving, but I'll leave that up to him.
So we want to go now to Capitol Hill, where we're joined by Bloomberg Government's Jack Fitzpatrick here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Jack, welcome back. I'm sure it feels good to be back after the long election and campaign recess. Certainly there is no time to waste for Republicans on the Hill, especially who have leadership elections tomorrow. Perhaps there's not going to be any drama. Speaker Johnson does seem set to keep his job, assuming the majority is retained. But what's going to happen in that Senate vote?
Yeah, the Senate is going to be a lot more interesting between the 3 members running for it, John Thune, John Cornyn, and Rick Scott. You may have seen Rick Scott responding to Trump's demand for recess appointments to rapidly get people confirmed without having to go through the traditional Senate confirmation process. Scott said he 100% agrees. There may be a bit of a debate over the Senate's role to advise and consent on that. And as members come back into the Capitol today, we'll probably get a little more feedback on the direction of that race. But you're right that Senate Republican leadership race appears to be much closer than anything in the House. The Speaker looks safe compared to, I mean, really, it was kind of considered a given that if they keep the majority, Speaker Johnson is in a pretty good spot. So the intrigue is more on the Senate side at this point.
So what's on the agenda for the lame duck here, Jack? We know that lawmakers have to fund the government beyond December 20th, and you can probably add some color to that. We are hearing maybe March now. They kick the can into the spring to buy some time. There's also the NDAA. There's also the matter of a farm bill, and I wonder if you see that getting any love or if they kick the can on the farm bill as well.
So the NDAA probably is the top priority for what they want to actually fully accomplish by the end of the calendar year. That tends to be a very high priority. The Farm Bill has been moving slowly. I know they're trying to get things together on that. There's been some discussion about whether they could, if that gets delayed, if they could take portions of the Farm Bill and actually put it into a reconciliation package, which would be alongside a tax bill later next year. So we have a little more work to do to figure out exactly what's going to happen with the Farm Bill. The last I've heard on government funding as of yesterday, according to a House Republican leadership aide, the expectation is they're going to kick the can with a stopgap into March. That's important not just because of the prospect of delaying government funding, but if they give the incoming Trump administration a deadline early on to avoid a shutdown, that could very well interfere with that major tax bill. It could interfere with the process of getting cabinet appointees confirmed by the Senate. So it would be a big risk for Republicans to try to set up a shutdown fight that early in a presidential administration. But that is what we've heard is the expectation, at least on the House side at this point.
Fascinating, as always. It's great to have you back on the Hill. Jack Fitzpatrick, reporting for Bloomberg Government. We'll be spending a lot more time with Jack as we get into that appropriations process and the stopgap funding bill that he mentions. But since we're talking about the Farm Bill, among other matters, we're pointed directly to an important conversation with Matt Karstens, the CEO of Landis, a farming collaborative that will be impacted by policy here in Washington. And Kailey, it's one of the opportunities that we love to take to leave the bubble here and talk to a stakeholder that will be impacted here beyond politicos in Washington. Matt, welcome. It's great to have you with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. Donald Trump says the word tariff is his favorite word in the dictionary. He calls it beautiful. How do farmers feel about it?
Well, you know, that's a complicated topic, as we all know. Agriculture really relies partially on exports and making sure that the goods our farmers produce, whether it's protein, grains, has an international market. So what I would say is, although there's a lot of complexity to a tariff, what we can always hope is that the farmer has a seat at that table. The voice of agriculture is being heard because they are the ones that with rural that helped elect him the first time, helped on this re-election, and they need to be at that table to make sure that we're finding the right balance between whatever we're trying to solve with the tariff and what it could mean for agriculture.
So what would you say if at that table about what that appropriate balance is and who we perhaps need to be most careful about targeting with tariffs for fear of retaliation on the agriculture industry in the United States?
Well, we've already seen an adjustment right now with what we used to be able to or were exporting to countries like China. That's already down quite a bit, and it's really affected our farmers in the Midwest. And this is several administrations all the way through where we're at and where we might be going. So I think the point that has to be made is we need to make sure the cause and effect has truly been balanced with what agriculture really needs and the cause and effect of that. We've seen margins come down substantially for our farmers. Now the good news is some expenses went down for them in the way they controlled their costs. And then we also had some good yields across the Midwest and across most of the country here. But in the reverse side, we've got to make sure that both sides are being understood, whatever the solve is and whatever the cause and effect is to agriculture, because those international markets are absolutely critical for companies like Landis and Conduit that are trying to move those goods out of our state, out of the Midwest, and get them into a position to go into a global market. And when you lose volume like we have to China, that has a long-term ripple effect, and it's hard to recover from.
Well, how much have we lost? How much have farmers lost when it comes to exports to China? Set the baseline for us here, Matt, before we even begin the conversation about additional tariffs.
Yeah, I think those numbers are always moving, and I haven't seen the latest, but I would say it's probably safe to say we're nearing around half of the exports that we used to see. I think there was an announcement today or earlier this week on Monday around a new port that now South America opened up, particularly for Brazil out of Peru, that China is very excited about taking imports from Brazil or Peru, the South American market as a whole, and moving it over to China. So there continues to be additional pressures that get put on. So it's not even where we're at, but what are other opportunities that some kind of a conflict could create that now there's another alternative that we just weren't used to. And that port will have an additional effect, not just on what maybe happens in South America to China, but other parts of the world as well. So today we're down quite a bit, and the future, particularly when you look at corn, looks a little more daunting as Brazil, particularly in South America, has a wider path of what they can do with increased yields and more acres that they're farming than ever before.
Well, Matt, as you talk about pressures, I wonder as well about cost pressures and inflation. I'm assuming this industry has been grappling with this over the last several years, as many have, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why this election resulted the way that it did. We, of course, have a lot of conversation about the way in which tariffs could lead to higher inflation. What would it mean for the agriculture industry, not only to have the potential retaliatory impact on the way in which the goods are being exported, but also the inflationary impact on if a tariff is placed on everything else, including equipment that they need to actually get those yields, to farm that land, to do everything they need to do?
Yeah, it all has an effect, right? And for our farmers that are engaged in this every day, they're balancing volume with price with their expenses. And I thought the farmers really have done a great job in 24. Luckily Mother Nature cooperated, and we got good yields out of what we needed in most parts of the U.S. Not all, but most. They did a nice job as farmers really pulling back on equipment needs and trying to reduce the expense on that side. So when you add the volume and the expense reduction that the farmers were able to capitalize on, they're going to be able to get out of 24 in a good position. But nobody knows what 25 really brings. And that's the uncertainty that exists here, is what will 25 bring from a cost standpoint, from a Mother Nature standpoint. So, and then you look at just interest line. Some farmers have never even seen this kind of an interest level or cost on their P&L. And those are things that are just adding additional pressure to the mix. So anything right now that adds additional pressure to our farmers is going to have a big impact on them, because we've taken a lot of those steps out in 23 and 24. And now we've got to look to the future and continue to try to find some kind of win here. And that's where, when you come back to exports and making sure our farmers have their goods that can go elsewhere, that's an important step.
Well, Matt, this is an incoming administration that has promised mass deportation and has also suggested that workplace raids might come with that. I know that remains a question at this point, and we may need to learn more about it from Donald Trump's immigration officials. But to the extent to which farmers are reliant upon migrant workers, what impact would a mass deportation have on your industry?
Well, it definitely has an impact. As I think about the Midwest and just across all of agriculture, actually, it's still a very human intensity business that we're in. And I don't know if that's different from a lot of industries, but agriculture for sure is no exception to that. And as rural populations continue to fall in the amount that's out there, it makes it even more challenging. Now, in the Midwest, H-2A workers have been a big part of the solution to how we've dealt with that, and will continue to be as we go forward there. But there are other parts, particularly in the western part of the United States, the Southeast, where it's not just H-2A, but others that they reach into. So again, I think getting that farmer's voice at the table will be essential, because as rural continues to slide in its population, and the workload is still there for manual or just humans in general, we've got to make sure that there's a balance there, and that Ag's voice is heard. And with hopefully a soon appointment of USDA, that person will have the Ag background and have the, so to speak, dirt on their hands to be able to reflect that and find the right balance, that Ag has that voice at the table and find that true balance.
All right, Matt Karsten, CEO of Landis, with a focus on the agricultural industry. Thank you so much for being here with us. And he's reminding us, Joe, that we still have many cabinet picks yet to learn about, including the Secretary of Agriculture and others as well, even as we had some confirmed just in this hour.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.